Wallace!
Grandstand tomorrow features the University Boat Race. 14 BBC cameras and a helicopter will bring the excitement of the race as it happens, with commentary by Harry Carpenter and Penny Shooter. Rugby Union dominates the rest of Grandstand with live coverage of the entire Scotland versus France International at Murrayfield. There'll also be coverage of the England versus Wales match on BBC2 at 2:50. An afternoon of sporting excellence in Grandstand from 12:15 tomorrow.
On BBC2 now, more comedy from Hawkeye and the rest of the members of the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, MASH. In 25 minutes here on BBC1, Laura and Remington Steele are on the scent of a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Now on BBC1 at 9:03, the news with John Humphrys.
The votes that say no to a strike, the miners' leaders must think again. Mortgages down by more than expected. Peace pact in Africa, old enemies get together. Too much to bear, a father's anguish over his murdered daughter. And portrait of a dead hero, Colonel H, in action. Good evening. Miners in 3 of the country's coalfields have voted heavily against the strikes urged on them by their union leaders. Tonight, the Northumberland miners came out narrowly in favour, but the result overall has put great pressure on the union leaders to call a national ballot and let all the miners vote. The majority against the strike was more than 4-1 in South Derbyshire, and in the Midlands almost as big. But it was closer than expected in the traditionally moderate Lancashire coalfield, just 3-2 against. The vote supporting the strike in Northumberland was just below the 55% needed to authorise a strike. Union leaders there want a national ballot. Tonight, almost every pit in the country is at a standstill, many of them shut by flying pickets. Today, the Coal Board got permission to take the Yorkshire miners back to court for contempt because they broke an injunction banning their flying pickets. The Yorkshire NUM could face an unlimited fine or the seizure of its assets, and they're worth almost £8 million. But the Yorkshire Miners' president, Jack Taylor, said his men will continue to carry out their union duties. He told them, "You're doing a magnificent job." But it's the activities of the pickets that seems to have prompted many miners to vote against a strike.
The overwhelming ballot against the strike had been expected. The result, at least from moderate coalfields with a tradition of voting against strike action, had never been in doubt. But the size of today's majorities, here in South Derbyshire, 83%, now puts the union under even more pressure to think again about the strike and perhaps to allow a national pithead ballot.
The National Union of Mine Workers during this last few weeks have become disunited, area against area and man against man, and it is essential that one of the priority that we bring the miners of this country together again without ripping each other apart.
At this hotel, miners' leaders gathered to consider the implications of another big majority vote against striking. 72% of the Midlands miners.
And this result, now from our people, their voice has been heard, the national executive will have to take heed to the Midlands area, and we're asking them to be recalled and that they call a national ballot and clear the whole mess up.
There was some limited production today in the Nottinghamshire coalfields, despite the 24-hour stoppage, the result of a truce between the miners and the flying pickets, who went home so that a strike ballot could be held free from intervention. It's been a delicate, uneasy truce, and now that the Nottinghamshire ballot is over and the result soon to be declared, the underlying fear remains of a return by the Yorkshire flying pickets and of further violence, because all the indications are that Nottinghamshire miners, appalled by the recent violence, have voted by a majority to reject a strike.
Lancashire are against a strike, but not as much as some expected. 59.1% rejected the call. That's 6-4 against. Scenes like this had swung it. 100 Yorkshire pickets blockading a Lancashire pit. Inside damage that's still being costed, done by pickets during the night. Mob rule, local colliers called it. They wanted to go to work.
I've been here since 5:30 this morning to come to work, and I ain't coming to work, not to picket my own pit.
But their officials, afraid of bloodshed, closed the pit instead. Pickets left in triumph, but warned if the ballot did go against them, they'd return on Monday.
We'll be back. The next spot is them, look there, I tell you for. The next spot is that there, in Yorkshire. Wait till I get round to them, don't you worry.
There's obvious satisfaction here at the Coal Board with the way the ballots have gone, and with even Northumberland calling for a national ballot, the hope here is that there will soon be one. But the board is still determined to go to court on Monday to seek damages from the Yorkshire area. It sees that as a way of bringing pressure to ensure that its employees can go to work if they wish. But today has still been the day in which the strike has bitten hardest in the coalfields, and the Coal Board has badly needed a break after a week in which it's been the union's militants who have made the running. The pattern of the week had been of steadily increasing success for strikers in closing down pits. From Monday, when nearly half the country's pits were still producing, the figure has plummeted every day to come down to a mere handful. After weekend meetings, many miners were still trying to go to work early in the week. But today, 4 days later, there's scarcely a coalfield in the country where work's going on at all. The reason is plain to see. The most extensive mass picketing since the steel strike and probably since the 1972 miners' strike. It's been on a scale the police and the new government legislation has so far been unable to cope with. There's little sign here of the provisions of the Pryor and Tebbit Employment Acts of 1980 and 1982, which made picketing away from your place of work unlawful and proposed limits on numbers to a suggested figure of 6. The question now is whether the ballot votes will be more successful in moderating the action. The position is that most of the pickets come from the 5 areas which have not balloted their members in recent weeks over this strike, though Yorkshire did get authorisation for strike action 2 years ago. The results of 5 ballots have become known, and the results still to come from 4 other areas, including the very important Nottingham area, the country's second biggest. But the signs there tonight is that it is voting too against striking. The miners' problem is that they're taking action when supplies of coal are at record levels for the time of year. 28-week supplies with spring and summer coming up. And the last time the miners had a spring offensive was in ill-fated 1926. So the Coal Board and the government are taking a long-run view of this dispute. They don't think a national strike vote can be delivered. But disputes like this are unpredictable and there are high risks for both sides. Already there look to be 2 certain casualties, the pits themselves and relations between miners.
The Attorney General said today the criminal law of the land applies to miners just as much as anyone else. Sir Michael Havers said the police had the power to stop flying pickets on the road and turn them back. If they refused, they'd be committing an offence. There's a big police operation to deal with violence on the picket lines.
Can I just tell you the situation around you?
High up on the 13th floor of Scotland Yard, more than 150 miles from the main coalfields, the nerve centre of the police operation.
Leicestershire, Derbyshire and Staffordshire forces have advised us that probably as from Sunday they may well be coming to us for some aid.
From here, senior officers follow developments 24 hours a day and coordinate the efforts of those involved. All 43 county forces are on standby. Any one could be asked for help at a moment's notice.
At a glance, officers here can see just what extra resources are available to them. Coloured arrows show the strength of the backup in any particular county and how quickly they can be sent to any particular pit.
Home Office officials and inspectors of constabulary are on hand to deal with any unexpected problems.
Well, as soon as they can, would you let me...
Humberside's Chief Constable, David Hall, has come south to take charge.
It's been very, very effective and, if I might say, very efficient. We've been able to satisfy all the requirements and to dispatch them very speedily to the centres they are being requested for.
Already, over 4,000 extra policemen have been called up from here. Thousands more are on standby.
Thank you very much. Bye.
2 Yorkshire miners arrested outside a colliery in Staffordshire were in court today. Thomas Werrett, who's from Doncaster, admitted obstructing the police and was fined £150. His brother admitted using threatening behaviour. His fine, £300. The cost of buying a home is coming down by more than expected. The building societies decided to cut their mortgage rates by a full 1%. It's the first cut for 8 months.
The building societies have taken their time, but after weeks of waiting, they took a close look at Tuesday's budget and saw no reason to delay further. One or two still wanted a smaller cut, but with money pouring in, they finally took the plunge. The budget had been kindest to the very low and the very high paid. Those in the middle, with incomes in the £10,000 to £20,000 bracket, did less well, but they're the ones with the big mortgages who will now benefit from today's move. On a £15,000 mortgage, repayments will go down by £6.75 a month after tax. That's on a new 25-year loan. At £25,000, the saving is £11.25 a month. But savers do badly out of the cut, with a disproportionately large 1% fall in the deposit rate.
It is a larger cut than we need have done because, as you know, the taxation of gilt profits, which came 3 weeks ago, has really made us increase their margin by about 0.25%.
So it's the government's fault for increasing the tax on you?
Well, I'm afraid I must say that, yes.
Economists think this latest round of interest rate cuts may be a one-off move rather than the start of a new downward trend, and interest rates may now stabilise for some time to come.
Inflation is holding at 5.1%, but the cut in the mortgage rate is expected to bring it down over the next 2 months. And on the stock market, the news from the building societies helped push share prices to new record levels. The Financial Times index closed up 18.7 at 894.3. South Africa has signed a remarkable agreement with a neighbouring country, Mozambique. For years, there's been bitter hostility between them. Today, their leaders signed a non-aggression pact, the first time there's been such an agreement between the white government of Pretoria and one of its black neighbours. Only a few months ago, President Samora Machel of Mozambique was comparing South Africa with Nazi Germany. But today he called the document a high point in the history of relations between our two states. And South Africa's Prime Minister P.W. Botha said it set a new course in the history of Southern Africa. The two men met at Komatipoort on the border between Mozambique and South Africa. Michael Burke was there.
The people of Mozambique ran chanting to the South African border today, a border where they were stringing up balloons celebrating peace. It's all an about turn for Samora Machel, the dapper president of a country facing ruin. Precisely on the frontier, the leader of white South Africa met his black Marxist neighbour for the first time and shook hands. Together they went into a train straddling the border to talk peace and cooperation to one another. It was an historic event, meeting in a train built for the British royal family when South Africa was not an international outcast looking for political recognition, and its neighbour was not independent and destitute. Outside, representatives from two armies that have spent years fighting rebels supported by the other gathered at a spot hewn out of the bush to mark the passage of history. President Machel called for an end to what he called the cycle of violence that was wrecking all of southern Africa. Prime Minister Botha said reality was at last being recognised on the subcontinent.
Signing this agreement today, we have opted for the road of peace.
A peace that would mean no interference in either state's affairs. Under the flags of both nations, they signed a treaty that will stop guerrillas using their countries for attacks on the other. To the South Africans, it was more than a peace pact.
They see it as a symbolic admission that black Africa's politics of confrontation against this last stronghold of white supremacy has been an empty sham, rhetoric in the face of reality. The wind of change, it seems, is now blowing backwards.
Malawi and Botswana never joined the front line against South Africa in the first place. Zambia and Tanzania are imploding into economic chaos. Zambia's President Kaunda is acting as broker in the peace process, which even President Nyerere of Tanzania reluctantly supports. Angola, split by civil war and battered by South African raids, is talking peace. Mozambique and Zimbabwe know that without Pretoria's help, their people will starve. Drought on top of inefficiency has starved thousands to death already. Across much of southern Africa, the rains have failed again, shriveling the crops, starving whole herds of livestock, and leaving countless children without food or even water. Mozambique admitted its weakness today. Zimbabwe hardly needs to. The country will run out of its staple food, maize, next month. It will have to buy and beg 750,000 tons this year from abroad, and it will all have to come from South Africa. Unless South Africa sends 1,000 trainloads of food north this winter, Zimbabwe will starve. Those campaigning inside South Africa for radical change in the country's racial policies now know they can't count on effective outside support.
No matter how well you subject the frontline states to your will, we, the people of this country, shall not give up our struggle for freedom and democracy and justice.
Most people knew it already. Now all the radicals here are saying it out loud.
In the United States, Senator John Glenn has dropped out of the race to become the Democratic candidate for president. The former astronaut was once thought to have a good chance, but now his campaign is more than $2 million in debt. Just 3 candidates are left: Walter Mondale, Gary Hart and Jesse Jackson.
There was a time he looked popular enough to become the Democrats' frontrunner. But despite campaigning for a year, Senator Glenn's lackluster speaking style and poor organisation blighted his chances. The former war hero and astronaut quit with campaign debts of nearly £2 million.
John F. Kennedy once said that every president must endure a gap between what he would like and what is possible. Unfortunately, the same thing is often true for presidential candidates.
Bowing out, Senator Glenn wouldn't endorse either Gary Hart or Walter Mondale, though he promised support for whoever's nominated. Today, more good news for Gary Hart. He came first in Alaska's caucuses, 41% of the vote to Walter Mondale's 31%. Though Senator Hart's trying to forget the biggest blunder so far of his campaign, accusing Mr. Mondale of questioning his changes of name and age.
I've spoken about a new generation of leadership for this country, and for some reason, Vice President Mondale wants to talk about my family name. There is a fine line between desire for office and an inordinate need for power.
In fact, Walter Mondale hadn't said anything offensive. Gary Hart was forced to apologise publicly, and Mr. Mondale was able to say, "My rival must be getting worried." Ahead, for both of them, a gruelling weekend of 5 more caucuses.
The White House has confirmed there'll be stringent new security measures to protect President Reagan after an armed man was shot by a police officer outside the grounds last night. David Mahonsky from Pennsylvania is said to have pointed a sawn-off shotgun at Secret Service agents who approached him. He is in a fair condition in hospital and is expected to face assault and weapons charges. The Irish Prime Minister, Dr. Garret Fitzgerald, met President Reagan at the White House today. They discussed ways of ending the violence in Northern Ireland and the prospects for the new Ireland Forum. Later, the two leaders enjoyed a more light-hearted exchange. Mrs. Thatcher's been having talks with Gaston Thorn, the President of the European Commission, before next week's summit in Brussels. He's trying to reach a compromise on the budget row, which is threatening another summit stalemate. Lord Whitelaw is to announce a government climb down over phone tapping. The government wanted to leave it to the Home Secretary to decide who's tapped, but after a revolt by some Tory peers, it's been agreed there'll be strict legal controls. Graham Bright's bill to clamp down on video nasties could be law by the summer. It passed all its stages through the House of Commons today and now goes to the Lords. A man has been accused of the explosion at a London Wimpy bar which killed a bomb disposal expert, Kenneth Howarth, in 1981. He's Thomas Quigley from Northern Ireland, who's accused of murdering Mr. Howarth and also of trying to murder the Royal Marine Commandant General, Sir Stuart Pringle. The parents of a little girl who was murdered last summer have spoken for the first time of their anguish and their fears. Police investigating the death of 5-year-old Caroline Hogg have today released an interview with her parents in Edinburgh in the hope of finding new leads.
There's a strong link between Caroline's death and Susan Maxwell. Just two youngsters that never did anybody any harm. Two young girls that's full of life, had everything to live for, just been spirited away.
We've made a number of appeals from a police point of view, but this is the first occasion we've had the parents willing to go on television. Hopefully, there's some person who has not yet come forward with the important information which could shortcut all our inquiries.
It's too much for anybody to bear. I mean, the wife and I are still trying to get over it, and I doubt very much if we ever will. But to think that it could happen again.
A Royal Navy Sea Harrier has crashed into the sea during the big NATO exercise Operation Teamwork in the Arctic Circle. The pilot bailed out and was rescued. 17,000 troops spent the day storming the Norwegian coast from a fleet twice the size of the Falklands Task Force. Gary Lloyd went with them.
9 NATO nations were called to battle stations, Falkland style. It wasn't chosen to rehearse past triumphs, but even the fjord looked like Falklands Sound. And some of the fleet could testify to that. This time they face a new strategic test, reinforcing the Norwegian army on Russia's doorstep. Along 50 miles of coast, the troops went ashore, among them 4,500 Royal Marines. For them, it's the culmination of 3 months' annual training for Arctic warfare. Experience of sub-zero temperatures here helped many of them in the Falklands. Armed Forces Minister John Stanley came to assess the exercise for himself.
Do you think there's any element of sabre rattling? No element of sabre rattling, but it is a very important element of deterrence that we show that we are trained to defend this particular very important northern flank of the NATO area.
Howitzer batteries are among 17,000 American troops in teamwork. It's their biggest ever commitment to an exercise here. Not even a blank is being fired. NATO commanders say that's unnecessary. They can make all the noise they need with the real thing if the time comes. No fewer than 300 aircraft have been keeping a lofty eye on events. Air interceptor practice has come in noticeably useful, not least in seeing off unwanted Soviet reconnaissance planes.
The last moments of Colonel H. Jones, who died charging an Argentine gun post in the Falklands, have been recreated in a painting. It was unveiled today at the School of Infantry at Warminster in Wiltshire, and Christopher Wayne was there.
Before taking command of 2 Para, H. Jones spent 2 years as an instructor at the School of Infantry. He and his wife Sarah had a house at Warminster, and they regularly visited the infantry mess. Today she returned for the first public showing of Terence Cuneo's painting of her husband winning the Victoria Cross. Soldiers who fought at the action said the painting has captured the unique Falklands light and the country around Darwin and Goose Green. In fact, Terence Cuneo posed his models on a hillside at Oxshott in Surrey. The Argentine uniforms have been brought back by the Scots Guards. Mrs. Jones cast a critical eye over the picture and seemed pleased with the result. Or has Terence Cuneo managed to capture H?
I think so, yes. I think probably it's very difficult for me to be the judge of that, because for me, obviously, it's a very emotional picture, so I think probably it's difficult for me to say exactly, but I think it is a very good picture, yes.
Besides a signature, every Terence Cuneo painting has one other hallmark. Somewhere on all his pictures, you'll always find a small mouse, and this one is no exception.
There's certain to be a fierce debate over England's cricket captaincy for the summer series against West Indies after David Gower's performance in the second test against Pakistan at Faisalabad. Deputising for Bob Willis, who's ill with a virus, he's won praise for handling the team and batting well. David Cass reports.
The day belonged to David Gower as the heir apparent to the England captaincy grew in stature with every over spent at the crease. Gower had watched Randall score a welcome half-century as he himself played the true captain's innings, and one more acclaim to add to that he received for handling the team in the field. He watched Graham Fowler return to first-class cricket and score a half-century too. Fowler finally mishit a delivery from Carter and was caught in the deep by Kazim Omar. He had scored 65. But they were all very much a supporting cast to Gower's talent. His innings of 113 not out silenced any critics who may have feared that captaincy would detract from his batting. If anything, the captaincy has improved him as a player. With 1 day left, the match is a certain draw. The fate of the series will now depend upon the third and final test, which begins on Monday.
Liverpool's monopoly of the Cannon League has been called into question tonight by Southampton and their striker Danny Wallace. The league leaders were beaten by 2-0 by Southampton. Wallace got both goals. The result opens up the championship. Manchester United could now take the lead by beating Arsenal tomorrow. And two of tonight's headlines again. The mortgage rate has come down by a full 1%. That's more than expected. And the main news, most of the miners who voted are against striking, in some areas by a big majority. Now it seems there'll have to be a national ballot. And the Archers are trying out a new actor. He's the Duke of Westminster, one of the richest men in Britain, and he'll be paid £75 for appearing on the radio programme for a day in May. He says he'll donate the fee to charity. That's it for now. Good night.
Good evening to you. Well, it's certainly been a rather cold week with an easterly wind, and I'm afraid the weekend prospects aren't really any different, still with this easterly wind, and still really that low pressure to the south and high pressure to the north being the reason for all this. The big problem has been with this easterly wind carrying cloud across the North Sea, and it's the eastern side of the country, obviously, which has borne the brunt of that rather cold, cloudy weather, with western areas doing somewhat better, brighter certainly. That low complicated things yesterday and earlier on today with a few showers, but that's moving away. And I think really for much of the weekend, very similar weather, still cold and cloudy near the east coast at times, with some brighter weather in western areas. If we start off with tonight's chart, there's one message, and that is a frost. And I think for many areas there'll be a frost tonight, fairly sharp frost in parts of Scotland. The last report I saw from the Highlands showed temperatures already below freezing there. So a cold night, 1 or 2 wintry showers left around the Northern Isles. And then for the rest of the central and western part of the country, a cold night, the cloud breaking up to give a frost. Perhaps not quite so cold near the east coast, but temperatures only just staying above freezing. And then for tomorrow, well, I think on balance, a bright day for many western areas again. You'll certainly have the best of the sunshine and a fair bit of shelter from the east wind. But close to the eastern coast, I'm afraid to say very much that cold, cloudy weather that we've seen a lot of recently. Perhaps the cloud breaking up in parts of the East Midlands at times and along the south coast, but otherwise very little change. And equally, I'm afraid the message is for very little change on Sunday either. Still frosty weather at night with the brightest weather in the west. And that's it.